Hello everybody, this is Zach from Kiesling Films. Today I'm joined by Macca from the Outer Circle. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
I appreciate it. Alright, let's get right into it. So what got you into the hobby in the first place?
Well, sort of two different events. So the first was I had a relative who travelled to England and brought me back some white metal models from England. But it wasn't until I actually got a taste of a proper Games Workshop store that I actually got into the hobby proper. And this was about 1994-ish, and second edition 40k specifically.
I see. Yeah. So, what got you into making videos on the hobby and just in general?
Geez, that's a funny question. So I was writing on a blog called Galaxy in Flames. It still exists, so you can go back and look at old blog sort of uploads back from like 2013, 2014 sort of era. And we were writing about, it was sort of content that you wouldn't associate with the Outer Circle. It was very positive, talking about the releases and lots of work in progress shots of like my army and the other people who were contributors on there. And what was happening outside of a Galaxy in Flames context was I was on a lot of different groups and forums, as you do. Like we have like Wargamer AU over here, but you'd have like, Battle of Lost Souls forums, that kind of thing. And everywhere you go on these, there would be this constant positivity, and it was what I would call toxic positivity, this level of ignoring deliberately that there are some very obvious problems in the hobby. Whether it was to do with pricing or whether it was to do with like how certain releases were handled, and voices were being silenced is probably the big point about it, where people would, you go on a forum, you'd say like, I got this box, but it was missing this content that I thought maybe this box set should have had. The squad can take let's say 4 heavy bolters and it's supplied with 1. We saw something similar to that with the Chaos Havocs in 40k. The rotor cannons that they got were all the rage, but you got like 1 in the box, so you had to go and find another way of acquiring them.
Yes.
And you'd be something as mild a critique as that, and the moderators, they would shut down your questions, or they would stop you from commenting for several days for them. Or it could have been something like a rules question, like, hey, the rule is written this way, but that really doesn't make sense. Do we think it should be written this way? People say, that's how Games Workshop wrote it, it's perfect, don't complain. And I got so sick of it. I said, you know what? I want to create a channel just to give me a chance to, air my grievances. And at the time specifically, it was the Chaos Codex for 6th edition 40k. When I created the channel was my number one pet grievance, because I was spoiled growing up by, had a good codex in 2nd edition, had a pretty good codex in 2nd and 3rd, and then we got a fantastic codex in 3.5. And then all that flavour, the uniqueness, the things that I associate with the best moments in the hobby in my life was just ripped from my arms. And what it was replaced with was something so bland and so vanilla and so generic. And it was really disappointing because it wasn't competitive on the tabletop, and all the flavour, the inspiration was gone, and I felt the hobby was worse off for it. And I wanted to share that with others, and not necessarily like make money off it or anything like that, or find myself in a position where I am now where it's like 20 odd thousand subs. More just a case of I just wanted to say like I have an opinion too, and I'm allowed to share it.
Yeah.
And I wanted people to be able to come onto my channel in the comments, hopefully respectfully, and share their opinions as well without them feeling the need to, bite their tongue or whatever, as long as they were respectful to one another. Like, if there's really insulting language, I'll get involved in the comments, but other than that, it's sort of free reign.
Well, it's cool because it's a good way to engage and have you engage in a healthy discourse, which is important on anything. There should always be a balance of negative and positive conversation about it. Whatever.
That's right. Everything should be, in my mind, two-way communication. Part of why I've given Warhammer community so much critique over the years was and like the Facebook pages and the related stuff is because it's not a two-way communications platform. It's an advertising platform where they go out of their way to sell you the models, right? They'll show you pictures of the model and all that, but they're not conversing with you. They're not taking what you have to say back as feedback or critique. They're talking at you, not with you, if that makes sense.
Yes. And it's important, especially when in a professional sense, that a company engages with you in communication, that you're buying a product from them, the least they can do is talk to you.
That's right. And for they're a lot better than they used to be. Let's not be rude here about it. Give them credit. Games Workshop in the early 2000s was a brick wall. You did not know a thing about the company. You didn't know who was working on what, and talking with the people working there was just about impossible. At least now there is some level of communication, even if I do consider it a bit underwhelming personally.
Yes, I see. So, next question is for you. What would you say is the greatest challenge for you in making videos on the hobby and covering so much topics in, broad spectrum on the hobby itself?
So in my mind, I've got a little voice in my head saying, how are people going to perceive this video? So many of the videos I make, I'm trying to make almost like a documentary format. I'll be talking about, let's say the state of Heresy in 2.0. And I'm not trying to make a negative video. I know, though, that it's going to be covering content which is going to be a critique because it's honest.
Yes.
And what's going to happen is I also know that when I hit Premiere and upload on that video, that someone inevitably, and then a group of people following in their steps, is going to come on and say, all you do is post negative content. And I'm going to look at my library of videos, and I'm going to go, there's 7 or 8 positive videos that I've done in a row. Surely I can get away with this one. And you know what? I never get away with it. I put up that critique video, and it's the hardest thing because I don't just want to be a channel that promotes the game. I want to try and promote realism, a realistic understanding of what people are getting themselves into, because I think I bear some responsibility towards people's decision-making process if they're coming to my channel, watching my content, and then saying, hey, I'm going to buy into this game. And therefore, if I'm having that influence on people, that impact, I should definitely be giving them the full picture, the full spectrum of what they're getting themselves involved in. It's the same reason I won't use any, Raid Shadow Legends, for example. They come to me every couple of weeks and say, put an advert in the start of your video, or them or someone else. It's inevitably some sort of monetization, mobile game, whatever. And I go,
yes.
No, because the impact of my video could lead people to do this, and I don't think this is a healthy choice for them. Therefore, I don't want to associate my content with this.
Well, that's
so those sort of are the factors in the back of my mind.
Excellent, and that shows. I personally think that's a very important thing to show that you have self-respect and respecting your audience too. On that, that's a very key thing is parodied videos. And that's really admirable, I think.
Well, I to be fair, I don't look down on people who create videos with that type of content either. I'm not going to say, oh, such and such's channel is crap because they put monetization in there, in some format, like shilling for a video game. But that's fine. If someone else wants to do that, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to judge the moral character of the people for it, but for me personally, I can't bring myself to do that. So it's my own personal perception of my work. So that's probably the big two things that come to my mind is who I am associating with in those videos, especially because my actions could have ramifications for the community.
That makes sense. And that's a good way to be self-aware about things. Alright, so this is another kind of question to you about the hobby relating to your work. You mentioned in one of your previous videos about how you worked in the plastic industry and the cost of models. And how do you feel that 3D printing and custom model making is going to affect the future of the hobby?
So I think in the next 15 to 20 years, that's how long I'm putting on it. A lot of other people are saying, Games Workshop has 5 years. No. 15 to 20 years, conservatively. If not longer. Because at the moment, 3D printing is too niche still. It's not user-friendly enough. People don't want to have to be putting on masks and gloves and pulling these resin models out that have, not high failure rates, but they do have failure rates. And they don't want to be handling nasty chemicals, fault finding their machines, having these machines that only have a few thousand hours of printing life, and then, they've got to handle these other noxious chemicals for cleaning. People don't want to do that. People are inherently lazy creatures, and they want the simple things in life. And the thing I often go back to is music. Think about what piracy was like in the early 2000s. I'm not sure what your age is. I'm mid-30s, and video, specifically music, as opposed to music video, was very, very pirated in the early 2000s. Things like LimeWire and that as well.
Yes.
I remember getting viruses on your parents' computer was back in the MySpace days.
Yes.
And the music industry, though, turned it around. And they figured out how to kill it, and that was they just had to offer convenience. The convenience of the service is, and to this day, convenience of being able to walk into a Games Workshop and buy a model off the shelf is more important to many people than the ability to 3D print as many models at home as you like, even if it's financially a far smarter move. Yes. And there are various factors that go into it, but we'll leave it at short point. In that music, they said, cool, we'll offer you a service like Spotify where it's cheap and you can listen to whatever you like, and it kills piracy for music. Piracy for music is pretty much non-existent now.
Yeah.
And Games Workshop's in a situation where they are offering convenience, and 3D printers are not really offering convenience. Even for myself, I've got like 10, 15 printers, varying points in time, and therefore even I don't find it super convenient, because you still got to pick the printer, slice the file, all that kind of thing. When printers reach a stage where it's like a paper printer, you just put a cartridge in there and hit the go button on your file, and you know that it almost every time is going to spit out a 100% perfect model, no cleaning, no noxious chemicals, anything like that. That's when 3D printing will kill Games Workshop's physical production model.
I see. Very interesting. Very interesting. Alright, switching gears now to more from the technical side of it. What's your favorite setting in Warhammer 40,000 or Warhammer the Horus Heresy? What is your favorite setting or preferred setting, and why?
Out of those two, or any setting?
Any setting. Like, you have a preferred hobby setting at all?
Probably Mordheim.
Oh. Really?
That old world fantasy, I have a lot of really fond memories of Mordheim growing up, to the point where I've still got several white metal warbands from that era. And then probably second behind that would be Lord of the Rings. It's just, I've had many clashes with the community over the years. But, Mordheim definitely for me. You could play any faction in Warhammer Fantasy. It got you into that world, and you didn't have to buy, there was no, season, for example, like you have with Warhammer Underworlds now, where it's like, hey, here's the rules, but, they expire in 12 months when we decide that we want to release a new box set. We're going to invalidate everything you own now. No, Mordheim was just a constant, like Necromunda is. It's an expansion on what it came out with. It's like, hey, the original game has, Midlanders and Marienburgers, vampires and witch hunters, Sisters of Sigmar and rats. But we're going to add orcs, we're going to add dwarves, we're going to add wood elves, down the line. That to me is awesome, because every faction can get in there, every faction's being supported, and the game encouraged you to do actual hobbying with your army. You weren't just buying something off the shelf. I mean, you could, but as your warband progressed along, it's like, I want to get this character a crossbow or something. It's like, maybe you cut the model's hand off and you give him a crossbow in that hand instead. And all these warbands started out from the same mold, no pun intended, but then they diverge off in such interesting ways, and people really own it, and they take it and they mold it into their own thing, and that's the thing I love seeing about the hobby, and that's why I really like Horus Heresy today. I know this is sort of me sidetracking the question. I do apologise.
Oh, you're fine. Please continue.
Horus Heresy is the last of the big game systems that encourages you to do that. That still encourages you to take the setting and mold it in your own image. You know, yes, there are rules in the universe that you're free to ignore if you want. But, you know, it's the last setting that's encouraging you, you know. Yeah. Why don't you give that commander a sword instead of a hammer? Why don't you give him a cloak? Why don't you give him a shield? Why don't you change up his personal heraldry? Maybe he's got Artificer this game. Maybe you're going to have the same character in Terminator armor next game. And it encourages you to really customize things. You know, maybe you have that squad sergeant who pulls off the Hail Mary in a game, and you go, I'm going to convert that squad sergeant to become a lesser character now. And maybe he has like the same markings on his armor or whatever, and he becomes, you know, a centurion, gets a promotion within your army.
Yeah.
That world building is what I find the most rewarding, because you're telling a story.
That's important.
That's fun.
That's very important. That's the important thing about the hobby, is having fun and telling those little narratives. I think that's the advantage of, say, hobbying, like miniature hobbying versus like video games. You can tell that story with your army as you grow your collection. You know, the stories develop, and I think that's a very important thing of it. So now I'm gonna get on a opinion I think you've posted in the past on your videos, but I want to see if your opinion has changed. What is your opinion on using Warhammer 40k models in 30k?
I'm totally fine with using models from other settings in 30k. If you... I've got some personal criteria. One is just put in the effort. You know, if you take a stock 40k model like a Primaris Marine and you just slap it down on a 30k tabletop, that's just laziness, and it's fine to do that to yourself. It's not necessarily fair to do it to the person who you're playing a game against, who they've put the effort into their army, and they're expecting to play a fun game against someone who put the same level of effort into their army, to help further telling that story and building that narrative and enjoying the setting. You know, it's one thing in Heresy to play a game and go, oh, my tactical sergeant in his Mark III armor took on this Alpha Legion infiltrator, this saboteur, and he actually killed him. Like, that should be almost impossible. It's a much cooler narrative than, so the Primaris Ultramarine from 40k got killed by my squad sergeant. That's pretty cool. You know, just has a totally different feel. So if people want to use those Primaris Marines, it's like go for gold, but maybe, you know, work on the weapon a little, change the helmet, change the shoulders, maybe get rid of some of the really obvious Primaris armor elements, like the way the flared knees are, the little balls on the sides of the ankles, you know, little things like that. The more of those things you change, the more and more acceptable it becomes. And of course, there's a point where it's like, cool, you have officially cleared the very, very low bar of making your model feel like 30k. And it is a very low bar, like, honestly.
Yeah.
Head, shoulders, weapons, all very easy to acquire, very cheap parts. The only reason people don't change them is laziness, my opinion.
I see. Alright, so then I want to ask you, what's your opinion on the newest edition of the Horus Heresy from...
It is another edition. That's, so people get very confused by this, because I critique it a lot, because, as I said, I feel it's very important to openly criticize things, critique them, so that the company in particular hopefully will one day listen to it and take it on board and do something about it. And Heresy 2.0 has a lot of big problems, but it gets some things very right. And it's the combination of those elements that leads you to say it's not better, but because there's a lot of negative changes, it can't be better. But because there was positive changes, it can't be worse either. So it's just another edition of 30k. Given a choice between having this edition or having an FAQ'd last edition, at this current point, I would go the last edition.
Well, Roland, answer to my second question. I was going to ask you about the hobby. What would you do as your preferred setting? So you would say you prefer the first edition over the second edition at this point.
At this point in time, but that's because this edition hasn't had time to breathe yet. The last edition, you know, it had 10 years. to establish itself, get that foothold, get a few FAQs in there, get some additional expanded content in there. This edition hasn't had time yet. Everything has been... What they have pushed out feels very rushed. It shouldn't feel as rushed as it does, though, in my opinion. But what they have put out, feels very rushed, feels very forced. Like they did stage 1 of creating the game, let's change rules. Stage 2, the playtesting, they just shrugged and put it out there. That's what it feels like. And until it has time to be, and it needs time, it needs to sit out there in the community. And all the pearl clutching, reactionary elements of the community, possibly like myself, need to have time to let our fears die down. So that the feedback that does get back to them is not too over the top and forces them to make too great a change, too great an extreme. For example, I was in a Games Workshop store today. I get on quite well with the local Games Workshop staff and community, and they were talking about a Tyranid player, and this kid, teenager, is playing Tyranids. Comes in one day this week, his army's worth 1,000 points. Games Workshop FAQs Tyranids because they were very overpowered in 40k. Comes back the next day, it's worth 1,500 points. Same amount of models. That's not the sort of thing I want to be seeing happen with Horus Heresy.
Yes.
So it's important that it is given time to breathe and allowed to grow, and let's see what it actually evolves into, as opposed to all of the pearl clutching that can happen right now, because one of the big consequences of my channel is, for better or worse, I talk about the problems, but then people focus on that as the sole issue, not the wider context of the video. So if I say, Dreadnoughts are absolutely busted as hell right now, people go, oh no, this game is so bad, let's not play it. And it's like, well, no. Like, yes, Dreadnoughts are a problem, but, there's ways we can play around that. Is it the worst issue in the world? All these things have to be taken into account when it comes to assessing the problem as a whole. And unfortunately, people get very fixated on that one element.
I see. I would say from personal experience, I think I've seen a lot in your comment section sometimes. Like, I have seen that where people start arguing about one certain issue and not talk about the broader side of the issue or the conversation as a whole.
It happens in both directions as well. The for outer circle's opinion versus the against the outer circle's opinion. Some people are like, oh, this video is trash, and then some people are like, oh, this video is great, and then they get at each other in the comments. It's like, this is not the intent, guys. I don't want you at each other's throats. And, at the end of the day, I am still a human being like the rest of you. I'm just as fallible as the rest of you, just because I have a very mildly successful YouTube channel, it does not make me better than you or correct all the time. Just keep that in the back of your mind.
Well, it's an opinion. Like any opinion, it's right or wrong doesn't matter. It's your opinion, and you have a right to it like everyone else has a right to their opinion.
Yeah, and you get to these situations where, I'll say something's bad, and then for some reason, that one sentence takes off in the comments, and it becomes just the one thing people are talking about, and there'll be, it happens to me where I'll have a 33-minute video, and the video will be 95% positive, and then there'll be a war in the comments over that other 5% every time, without fail.
Well, again, I guess a lot of people unfortunately lack the ability to agree or disagree and move on from conversation. That is just an unfortunate fact of the modern day we live in.
It is a fact of the world.
Alright, next question for you is, what is your favorite faction and why? In Warhammer or whatever your favorite setting is, what is your favorite faction?
In all the settings? Or in, like Horus Heresy?
Let's go through it. Let's start with Heresy, 40k, and then Fantasy. And we'll go down the list.
It is a really, really tough one to call for the Heresy. I think every single Legion, except for the Space Wolves, has redeeming traits and that make them really interesting to me. And unfortunately, a lot of the writing, especially at the end of the Heresy series, has sort of tarnished or ruined several Legions. In a lot of ways, because either you get this, you get the Perturabo situation where there's so many conflicting writers with their own opinion on how to write the character that the character just comes off as bipolar. and not in the narrative was designed that way, but more just he's completely different personalities from book to book. That makes it really hard with some legions. The first you absolutely love them, and then like your D&D alignment chart, like lawful good, neutral, true neutral, well, there's like chaotic spastic is probably should be on there, because that's what some characters become. It makes it very, very, very hard to pick a favourite force, but I'd probably say someone like the White Scars or the Raven Guard, people with a lot more common sense, something approaching more realistic way that they prosecute their campaigns. And I also, maybe I'm a contrarian, I also get drawn more towards the least popular factions, because whether it's a combination of people not playing them or people underappreciating them, or it could be because all the big name legions get given to the riders with the big names, whereas the other legions, like say White Scars, they're forgotten legions, so they give it to an up and coming rider like Chris Raitt, and he just knocks it out of the park.
Yes.
Well, so bit of a non-answer, but
that's okay. So let's go on to 40k. What is your favorite? Do you have a favorite faction in 40k?
Probably such a tough one. 40k suffers from the same problem. I guess my old school sensitivities, Thousand Suns and Zinch in 40k, I've been playing them since the mid-90s, so I think it'd be wrong of me to not say them.
Okay. Alright, I mean, that's fair. I assume that's your first starter army you played. So, then what's your favorite fantasy faction?
Old school Warhammer Fantasy would be the Chaos Dwarves.
Alright, very nice. And have you played Age of Sigmar or any of the other newer stuff at fantasy, and then I guess the new fantasy setting?
Yes, I have. Oh. I have 2 Age of Sigmar armies.
Very nice. What is your opinion on Age of Sigmar as a game system?
Out of all the new iterations of game that have come out since the end of 8th edition fantasy, so everything that's come since Heresy 1, I think Age of Sigmar is probably the best of those systems, realistically. It is better than Heresy 2, it is better than 40k 8th and 9th. Heresy 2, like I said, needs time to grow, but Age of Sigmar 2 and 3 are both much, much better than Age of Sigmar 1 was, and the game is an awful lot easier for people to get into than Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition was.
I see. So
it's probably the system they've got most right out of the big 3.
I see. Speaking of Warhammer 8th edition, and how do you feel that the changes made as an overall trying to progress the story in 40k, for example? What's your opinion on the Primaris Marines being added to 40k and the lore behind them? What do you think about them? Did you think it was the right step in the right direction, or what do you feel about them?
The lore is atrocious because it undermines the setting. So separating the models and the lore out from one another, let's put models to one side for the moment.
Okay.
The lore destroys the fundamental tenets of the Warhammer 40k universe, which is the Imperium is crumbling. It's the late Roman Empire. The barbarians are at the gates, and the Space Marines are leading this heroic last stand against the dying of the light. However, the Space Marines are also not to be looked up to because they're these weirdo space monks who aren't really looking out for the common human. They're religious zealot nutters. There is no true good guy in the setting. And since 7th edition 40k ended, they've really pushed the factions to change from that sort of aspect to the Imperium being basically traditional science fiction human analog good guys. There is not much separating the moral standards of the humans in, say, Halo from the humans in Warhammer 40,000 now. A lot of that grimdark element of the Imperium is just as bad as everyone else. Has really been dialed back to it's there. But in my opinion, as the person looking in, it's like, well, if you don't talk about it, you don't express it, you don't show it, you're not really showing or saying or doing anything to show that it's there. It may as well not be there at this point. The grimdark has just been so pushed to the side, and it can go too far. You can get grim derp, as we like to call it, where something is so silly in how dark it is that it sort of breaks the fourth wall. But the setting as a whole, it really suffers for it because Imperium should not be one of hope. And when Cadia fell and the Cicatrix Maledictum happened, that should have had huge ramifications, and people like to tell me that it does. But it really doesn't, because you start, you just ask some common sense questions like, why does it have ramifications? How? I say things like, oh, well, demons can attack our world anywhere and anywhere. And it's like, well, demons could do that anyway. Oh, well, warp travel has become really difficult. Warp travel was pretty damn difficult to begin with. Like, what else have you got? And the excuses become very thin on the ground. You sort of get to a point where you realise, well, in a way, nothing has changed in the setting, in that the Imperium's plight is no worse. But on the other hand, the Imperium's plight is a lot better because they have thousands of superior Supermarines and all this brand new equipment, which puts we are technologically stagnant and regressive and we're heading into a dark age. It blows all of that narrative out of the water.
Yes.
And so you end up in this horrible situation where it's like, oh yes, the Imperium is really stuck, it's really suffering, but we have a tactician Primarch who's come back from the dead, and that's a real big help. And we've got all these new Marines, we've got all this new technology, our forces have been bolstered by tens of thousands of reinforcement Space Marines. What is it, like 1 million Primaris or something? So you basically just doubled the amount of Space Marines there are in the galaxy overnight.
Yes.
That has major plot ramifications, and you can't even say that the quality of the competition Guilliman has is that great, because, well, the World Eaters, for example, they're, Angron's coming out very soon. We know the Lion is probably coming this year. It's one of my big predictions for this coming year, is the Lion. Because it just makes sense with the Dark Angels releases and that, but
yeah.
I also think we'll see a new Dante. But the quality of the competition, it's like, how many World Eaters are there? Well, there's probably an awful lot less than the amount of Primaris that just got spat out of the cloning vats,
Yeah.
And strategically, I think Guilliman is probably going to be a lot better at entrapping Angron than Angron would be at entrapping Guilliman. Just something about the level of tactical acumen between the guy who just screams and spits and swings axes versus, the very composed Guilliman. You can't really say that they're on par with one another.
Yeah. Angron's typically, his characterization's always been an very angry, unthinking, well, that's the thing in the Betrayer novel, Heresy.
Yeah, he's chaotic stupid.
Yeah. And Guilliman is very much tactical reserve, so I can see you're coming on that. It's a very good, valid point on it. So what about the models? What do you think of the Primaris models and how they're designed?
The Primaris models are 50-50 hit and miss. I blame digital sculpting for the majority of that problem, and people have to understand, it's not that digital sculpting is a bad tool. It's a fantastic tool. I use it myself. It's that because it is so easy to do things in digital sculpting, that people overdo it. They go, oh, I just want to add more detail, And you start adding all these little things that aren't needed. I think the Nurgle range is symbolic of that, where you just have so much weird tentacles and like coral wreaths growing out of models. Looks like there should be clownfish swimming around some of them. Which
Yes.
was, to me, never the correct aesthetic, but, it gets so overdone because it's so easy to do, whereas in the old days, someone had to sit there and, they had to sculpt it out of green stuff.
Yeah.
And that took a lot of time. It didn't take 5 minutes, it took time. and then to actually add it onto the models. And they've got these deadlines they're staring down, whereas now, you don't have to sculpt an asset necessarily. There are so many assets in their repository. They just click and drag and then it's on there. And so you get these tanks like, take a Primaris repulsor tank. You've taken something like a Land Raider and you turn it into a Grav Raider. Fine. Totally cool with that. It's a thing in Heresy. It's a cool concept. But then you gave it more firepower than a Land Raider. It's like, so you've got the armor, you've got way better mobility, and you've got more firepower. Well, what's the bloody trade-off here? In universe for this, and it's stupid. But then on the other hand, the basic Primaris Marine design is perfectly fine. It's very committee feeling. It looks like a committee sat down and said, "What are the most iconic elements of the Space Marine? How can we, capitalize on this for marketing purposes?" But but they look fantastic. And a lot of the characters like Mephiston, right?
Yes.
Or Azrael that's coming out. Those kind of guys, I have no problems with realistically. I think the turning traditional characters into Primaris is a huge faux pas from the background perspective, but as models, they are beautiful what they've done with them. Then you have things like the Primaris aggressors and such, where it's like, no, that doesn't work. They, those Gravis armor, Teletubby bodies, look like they're a bit paunch around the waist, a bit fat. And then you've got those other ones that look like NASA astronauts that have got like the underslung heavy bolters under the arms, the jump pack boys. They look awful. But the more traditional stuff, like the latest sort of 40k starter set that they got, the Dark Imperium one with, the sword and board guys and the chainsaw bolt pistol guy, that's all fantastic,
Yes.
And I think in a way they're starting to learn their lesson because they probably know that they got Gilliman wrong. There are a lot of crappy aspects about that model. They didn't do the best job with Marnius Kelgar. And so with others like the Black Templars characters that we've seen, or Mephiston, they're very, very similar and just really scaled up versions of their former selves. And that works really well. And I think they're sort of clued on to, the fans have a certain level of nostalgia and, let's exploit that. And that is probably the correct way to go about it.
I see. So, what are your feelings? The Primaris Marines are kind of true scale models compared to the older models. Do you think that's appropriate for the hobby to go push that way? Hey, and also, what's your opinion on the whole thing that in Primaris in game they can't use old firstborn vehicles and vice versa?
Well, you end up in this weird place of. So, speaking on it fundamentally from a miniatures creation standpoint, there was no need to go bigger. The problem was they made other factions like Guardsmen too big. They needed to go smaller on other factions, not bigger on Space Marines. Because now you have bigger models on bigger bases, they fill more of the table with less models, which means the epic grand battles that we were working towards my whole life are now thrown by the wayside.
Mm-hmm.
When I started in the mid-90s, a huge game was 3 Land Raiders, 30 Tactical Marines, an Assault Squad, and a couple of HQs. That was a massive game for one army to bring to the table.
Yes.
Then, by the time you get to 5th edition, you'd be seeing like 10 tanks in a Marine army. Half a dozen Razorbacks, a couple of Land Raiders, some Predators. You were seeing all of this happening in later editions of the game. And the games were getting bigger, but they were taking about the same sort of, 2.5, 3 hours to play. So we'd gone from 1,000 points being a standard, let's say, in 3rd edition, to 2,000 points at tournaments being standard in 6th edition or 5th edition 40k.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to the quote-unquote streamlined, more simplified, better 8th edition. And all of a sudden the game's taking just as long, but you're seeing like 15, 20 models on the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's not right. That's not right in my head. So the whole point of Warhammer was this wasn't the skirmish game. The competitors to 40k, like, let's look at what some of them are. Like Battletech.
Mm-hmm.
Battletech is very small models, and it's not a huge model count. Most games I seem to find are about 20 models. What about War Machine, for example? or Infinity. Well, they're very much skirmish level games. They're not the little 5-man sort of level skirmish games. They're the sort of 10 to 20-man skirmish games. Then you had Warhammer. Warhammer was the, like, you can bring an army to the battle. Whoa, how cool is that, you know? And that's the whole, you know, I won't swear. It's the whole point of Warhammer was you have a massive selection of units in every codex because it's expected that you can bring that massive selection of units, and yet name me when you actually see that in practice. It doesn't happen now.
Yeah. Most games don't allow that.
Most games you don't see it, especially tournament games. You know, in tournament games, you could see... I remember playing a person in 6th edition tournament who bought a Nurgle zombie horde Chaos Force. And he had like 120 models in that 2,000 point game. I have not seen anything approaching that when I've walked past a 40k event in the last 4 years. So there are major ramifications to making those models bigger. And it also means that when it came to updating the lines, all your tanks are now an awful lot smaller. You know, it was already pushing the limits on 10 Space Marines fit in a Rhino. Sure they do, wink wink. But now you put a Primaris Marine next to the Rhino and he's the height of the Rhino. You know, it's... Unless you're going to go back and you're going to resculpt those Rhinos, and even the newer tanks like the Primaris Repulsors are not big enough for what they're supposed to carry. So you end up in this situation where you're now chasing your tail. Are you going to resculpt the Rhino? No, they're not, because they just released Rhinos in Heresy, the same size as the old Rhino. Okay, so they're not going to do that. They're not going to resculpt Land Raiders in a new scale. So the infantry got bigger. The vehicles just look comically small next to them. Whereas if they kept Marines the same size, they wouldn't have this problem. So all of what I've just said, you can put to one side and go, that's a fact. But the other fact is, people want instant gratification, and they don't want to learn how to get good at painting very small models. You know, this could be just me projecting, by the way. So people go, what is the quickest and easiest thing for me to paint? Well, it's a bigger model. And so you get people go, I think painting Primaris Marines that are only, 2 millimeters tall, let's say, is way easier to paint. It's realistically not in the scheme of things. Once you get down to a certain size, the certain level of talent applies. But they think it's easier to paint, and so that's more attractive to people when something's easier to paint that has a certain selling point to it. Versus, if you don't believe that, look at armies like Dark Eldar. Dark Eldar are a good example of a harder to paint faction because lots of spiky armor, lots of edge highlighting, because there's so many little armor, zigzaggy armor plates on them. Okay, and a lot of bare flesh as well. Bare flesh is hard to paint for people. You got dark armor, you got to paint bright, pasty, pale white flesh. That's a lot of layers. It's a lot of you don't want to get those brush strokes. You want it to be nice and smooth. Getting it to look like the cover art is very difficult. So it's very unrewarding, and the instant gratification is not there for people. Versus Primaris Space Marines. Give it one big hit of blue spray paint, and you're 90% of the way to painting your all-terrain. So that's a fact that you can put in another box, and you can't examine any one of these things in isolation. You've got to take the whole rounded picture. And unfortunately, when I have spoken about these things on my channel, just to divert off topic, people will pick one of those topics. And so I'll say, it's a shame that they've changed the scale, because look at how small the Rhino looks next to Marine now. And someone else will turn around and they'll just start talking about, yeah, but it's so much easier to paint. It's like, different topic, guys.
Yes, and
they're different, related but different.
This makes sense. And it's okay, so speaking of the hobby side of it, on a lore standpoint, because it's kind of a bit earlier, do you feel that the phasing out of the Firstborn that's been kind of going on for the last couple of years now, do you think that if they completely phase out the Firstborn, that 40k as a setting is going to change drastically, like a certain feeling might be lost? That you were speaking earlier about the Grimdark being lost, but do you feel that they got rid of the Firstborn entirely, which they've been kind of pushing for the last couple of this last edition and stuff heavily? Do you feel that would be a major impact and change, or how would you feel about that?
My personal belief is that as time goes on, the word Firstborn will just vanish, and Primaris Marines will just be used much in the same way that we don't talk when we talk about Space Marines now, we don't think back to Rogue Trader when Marines were just guardsmen, do we?
Yeah.
So that will happen with Primaris Marines, given enough time. It just happens, though, that people have lots of armies of old-school Space Marines, people are in love with the old designs, maybe they prefer a different scale or whatever, that's fine. But people love the old design, so it's going to take a while for that love to fade out. In Games Workshop's world, they probably sat there saying, we want to do an Age of Sigmar hard reset, like they did with Warhammer Fantasy, right?
Right.
Where they just come in, torch it all to the ground, piss on the ashes, and then sell new models and profit, right? That's probably their ideal world.
Yes.
But they looked at what they did. Age of Sigmar, though, was the trial with Warhammer Fantasy for doing that, and it was not successful. Okay, when it came out, it bombed hard, Age of Sigmar. But they kept at it, they reworked it, they reinvented it, they came out with, more rules, they got rid of all the silly, if you stand on one leg and point at the sun, you get a reroll, they got rid of all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
And they turned it into a perfectly fine game, which sadly, because of the reception, the way they released it, many people to this day will not touch. But my belief is it's a very fine game. 40k almost ended up in the same boat, but instead what I think it is now is this drawn-out death. You're watching the last crucifixion of, the passion of the 40k, where it's carrying the cross through the street right now with the crown of thorns on. May sound very overly dramatic to people, but you got to understand from where the game was to how much it's changed, without actual change occurring. I know that sounds like an oxymoron. How can these statements be true? But as I said, the universe has changed in regards to, look at the Primaris Marine influx, look at the way Grimdark has gone out.
Yes.
But the basic tenets of the setting, the tower in this corner, the Eldar are a dying race, Imperium is fighting everyone, all of that is still true. So, it's just they're going through and slowly writing out the more troublesome aspects of the story, we'd say, to give the story more wide sort of mainstream appeal, make it more, more approachable to parents. But, it's one of those funny things. As a kid, what interested me in 40k was the dark setting.
Yes.
Because when you're a little kid, what do you want? You want to feel like a grown-up. You want to feel like what is a better feeling when you're like 14 years old than like the 18-year-olds say, hey, you can come hang out with us?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good feeling.
Yeah.
It's a great feeling. And 40k was that. You were a kid, and when you finally went from being the little kid in the store to, hey, why don't you come over and play with us? That's like the, oh my god, moment for you growing up.
Yes.
And part of the setting that made it cool was, it was that heavy metal and, that late 80s, early 90s heavy metal world with this gothic architecture and this universe that drew you in. And losing those elements turns it into just any other generic sci-fi universe. It's growing closer to StarCraft than StarCraft is growing to it. And
yes.
when you lose that, you lose a little something about the game that drove people in the first place to get into it, I feel.
I would agree. Actually, that's a very valid point on that. Okay.
I don't know if it was like that for you, but...
So, I guess I'll go on a little tangent. I actually got into 40k during 5th edition. I was 8 years old, and I stumbled across it on the internet. I found a couple of videos about Warhammer, and then I came across the YouTube channel Mini Wargaming. I don't know if you know who they are.
Yes.
I used to watch...
I like the guys at Mini Wargaming, actually. Yeah. I've not really conversed with them, but I do like them.
Yeah. I started watching their videos. I used to collect the little plastic Green Army guys, and then when I came across 40k, I thought it was really cool, because I saw this cool setting of, like, Space Marines and everything. I thought it was really cool. So I started researching it, and I found Space Hulk, and then I read a couple of novels for Space Hulk, and I started getting into literature. And I fell in love with the Grim Dark of 40k around the 5th edition, and then I never really got a chance to interact with the older editions. And then after 5th edition, I kind of dropped out because I was a kid and I couldn't really afford it. and then I got a job, and I started collecting models around 6th and 7th edition. Didn't get a chance to really play it because I live in the middle of the boonies, so didn't really have a chance to build much of a hobby collection until I could start driving. So, no, for me, that's something that I've always personally kind of struggled with the hobby, in a sense, is I have, especially with the changing, like the Primaris, I always kind of relate them to Attack of the Clones, Episode 2 of Star Wars and stuff. Like, kind of same feeling for me, like, I had collected this army, and then they released this all new range of models, and it's like half your models are considered invalid now because, they pushed in the gameplay aspect of it, like, Primaris Marines are better than Firstborn. So they kind of push this element that they're going to force you to, if you want to win games, they want you to be, it's like a pay-to-win, basically, setting, and I don't really like how it's in video games, and I don't like how it's being influenced in the hobby.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So, alright, next question for you. What's your favorite character or least liked character in Warhammer? For narrative and just a model standpoint.
I think my least liked character would be Lehman Russ.
Okay, mind explaining
Emperor, as written, is probably fighting for second place, but I'd say Lehman Russ, the model is okay. It's not the best of the Primarch models, but Lehman Russ as a character is just such a big hypocrite, and the way people defend him in the Space Wolves gets very tiresome. So that one sort of speaks for itself. Favorite character? Ooh, that's a tough one. There's a lot of cool characters like, Dante, for example, who are cool, but they're being propped up, and you kind of feel like you're being told this person is cool, you should like them. It's not naturally like you come to like them.
Yes.
So I'm going to say that for 30k, because I picked Lehman Russ for 30k, so to keep in spirit of that, I'll say probably Jagadai Khan. Just, if only for putting the greatest burn in all of Warhammer onto Fulcrum.
That is true. And anyone who doesn't have the context of that, I will try to post a link down below to the extra about that. But actually, do you mind telling them, Macca, what the quote is?
Yeah, so during the Triumph of Ulanor, the different Primarchs sort of got to spend some time with one another, because normally they, despite being the 18 brothers, they didn't actually spend a lot of time with one another during the Great Crusade, because these are generals fighting in different parts of the galaxy trying to conquer. And for some of these Primarchs, it was pretty much their first time meeting, and they were all sort of sitting in a room, a few of them. It was Mortarion, Sanguinius, Fulgrim, and Jagadai were sitting in a room talking. And Fulgrim was basically being Fulgrim and talking about how good he was and how he kicks so much ass because he's Fulgrim. And Khan's sort of judging him. He's judging, and he looks at Sanguinius, who's sitting next to him, and goes, Sanguinius looks regal, and he looks like he was just born that way. Whereas Fulgrim looks like a tryhard. Like, he wants to be Sanguinius. And because he's just got that aura, like a guy when he's on a night out trying to pick up a chick, he just gives off bad vibes, you know? And then the topic comes up of who would beat who in a fight, and Fulgrim's basically, I'm the best on Fulgrim, and Jagadai turns around, surprising everyone, and actually opens his mouth and says, I think I'd win, basically, I'd take you. And Fulgrim gets very pissy at this, because he's Fulgrim, he's the best. And Jagadai says, well, look, in my opinion, you shouted to the rooftops about your fighting abilities, people have recorded you in combat, everyone's seen how you fight and how you do it. Here's me, no one has a clue about me, you don't know a thing about me, you don't know how good or bad I'm a fighter, and I know everything about you, I think I have the edge and I would win. And Fulgrim then sort of changes topic. He goes, well, I heard you do strange things to your ships, because the White Scars are renowned for modifying their spaceships so they can go faster, more engines, that kind of thing. And the Khan, without missing a beat, turns around and goes, well, I heard you do strange things to your men. And Sanguinius sort of has to step in and go, oh, let's dial it back a step, guys. Because the blood was about to be spilled.
That's a typical brotherly thing to say, and one of our brothers step in and the peacemakers step in, so let's calm down for a second. Alright.
Yeah, this is before like the Noise Marines or any of that kind of thing, so This is a very unveiled comment.
Well, that's why Jagged he may go fast, but he also has those slick burns, I guess.
Oh yeah, the cutting edge on Shogris when it comes to burns.
Yeah. Well, I guess he read The Art of War and paid attention to the psychological warfare part of it.
Have to check that he didn't grow up in, Sparta.
Yeah.
When it comes to those kind of comebacks.
Ooh. All right. Hey, so I want to ask you, what's been your favorite model to work on in your personal collection of models? What's been your favorite model to work on?
That is a really tough one. So I have all of the Primarchs.
Really now?
And they are fantastic models because, funny enough, the only one I haven't opened yet is still in its little black Bordeaux box behind me is Jagged Khan, because that's sort of the end of an era once I open that box. So, I naturally you sort of gravitate towards those, but I don't know. There's been like some old Warhammer Fantasy stuff that just was a pleasure to paint. Like Zacharias the Ever Living. It's one of my favorite older fantasy models. I really enjoyed that. I had to paint a really cool White Scars Praetor and did like a lot of freehand on it. This White Scars Praetor on a jet bike, and I did like all these like watercolor, Asian watercolor style artwork on it with like
Ooh.
the cherry blossoms and like the
Oh.
finches in the trees.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah, and it was only a gaming piece, so it's not like one of those crazy Golden Demon winner jobs, but that's because it's something I've got to be okay with getting damaged on the table.
Yeah.
There's a fine line between what I can do and what I choose to do, and that was sort of the utter extent of what I was willing to do. But I'd probably say just it could be simple things with models as well, like tanks and infantry can be a real pleasure to paint. So, I'll probably go with Heinrich Kemmler, the old Witchmaster model, just because the tattered skin cloak and stuff, and he's a very old model now, but I don't know, something about it. It's just very old school Warhammer and very, very satisfying to paint.
Yes, I see. Hey, very good. Alright, so next question for you. How long do you plan on covering the hobby, and do you have any future plans further down the road to cover other subject matter, maybe?
Every time I try to deviate from my sort of normal topics, I don't get a lot of positive feedback. So that does make it hard. I have a secondary channel that focuses on history, specifically like Australian military history. And I haven't really gone out and advertised that channel at all yet. It's actually picked up a few subs, but I can't even remember how to log in because it's been so long since I last did upload to it. And that's a channel I really want to start growing. If I can figure out how to log back into it, would help. And I just did an hour-long documentary for it about the evolution of British artillery in the First World War, which to many people would be absolutely boring, but to someone like me, it was a great change of pace from the topics I have normally done on YouTube.
Yeah.
And it was actually crazy doing a deep dive on it and just seeing how much those tactics changed, because we think of World War One, we think of this very static war, which were lacked in innovation, and the generals were all completely useless, and sort of turned out to be the exact opposite once I did the deep dive on the subject.
That's very true, and speaking on that, history is rarely what people often think it is, and if you actually think about it, in the rapid advancement in technology from the First World War, from the beginning and the end of it, it was actually kind of crazy in how short a time frame, actually how tactics and weapons changed from basically the Victorian era of warfare to, well, the birth of modern warfare.
I'll give you one example.
Yes.
From that video, which was sound ranging. So, at the start of the First World War, most people did artillery spotting exactly as that. They would sit there with a set of binoculars, if they had them, and they would say where they think the shell fired landed. Right? Makes perfect sense. By the end of World War One, the British had developed a microphone technology, and doesn't work the way the microphone we think of does. What it was these platinum wires, and whenever a explosion happened, that explosion would push air in the shockwave, and that air flowing over the wires cooled the wires, and it changed the resistance of the wires. And so they would set these microphones up around the battlefield, and whenever a German gun would fire, the shockwave of that gun firing out of line of sight across hills would reach these microphones. And if you have multiple microphones and they all pick up the same shockwave, and you can tell the distance in time between each microphone and how loud it was, where it came from, you draw a big ring going out from that microphone where it could possibly be, and where they intersect with the other microphones was where the gun had to fire from. And they got it down to within 25 yards. So when the Germans started firing a gun, within 3 minutes the British could tell to within 25 yards in 1918 where that gun was firing from.
That's impressive.
And that's just one of the technologies they came up with.
That's impressive, and I learned something new today. Thank you for sharing. And
so, yes, if you want an hour on that, I have done an hour-long video, which I intend to upload at some point, hopefully on that second channel.
Well, I'll keep an eye, and I'll make sure I'll share a link with my audience so they can check it out and follow that. Oh, alrighty-o. Alright, that's all my questions I have for you today, Macca. Thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I hope I didn't talk too much.
It was a pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation. Everybody in the audience, please go to watch The Outer Circle, subscribe to his channel, subscribe to his second channel, help grow that channel, and thank you very much again for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always nice to just chat. Yep.